Well, hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WGSN-DB Going Solo um, Veterans Corner. And I tell you, I just started off the show and already got tongue-tied. But WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And as far as I can remember, I'm still your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. I'll get it together here in a minute. But I want to welcome everyone back to another live edition of our show and say to our audience, thank you for joining us. For those of you that continue to send us information and send us tips on things and ideas, we really appreciate it. Please keep them coming because we will use some of them. And if for some reason we can't, we will let you know as well. Well, we can't use that, and we'll let you know. But we do appreciate you watching the show, and we do appreciate all the information and the emails that we get. So before we get started tonight, I want to take a moment, as I usually do, to thank our great sponsors. And of course, first we have Quest Jewelers from Merrifield, Virginia. And folks, I tell you every show, but I have to tell you, you need to contact Pete and Wantain at Quest Jewelers. There's their number on the screen. There's the website. And whether you're looking for something just off the shelf or you're looking for something unique, call and talk to them. Take a look at their website. Give Pete a call. And when you call Pete, tell him you watch the show and he will take care of you, and he'll also give you a discount. So please, service our sponsors because we do appreciate them. I also want to thank Nationwide IT Services. NIS is a service-disabled veteran-owned small business owned by retired Army Warrant Officer C.K. Park. C.K. and his crew are located here in Fairfax, Virginia. And one of the things I really like about C.K. and his company is he gives a lot of support to veterans and veteran communities, as is evident as he sponsors this broadcast. But he also hires veterans, and he and his crew there can help you with everything that your business may need, whether it's IT, whether it's training, whether it's performance management, program management, anything that you think you need. Please take a look. There's their information. Look them up and talk to them and see if they can help you. I'm pretty sure they can. So we're gonna go back tonight, and unfortunately, you're gonna get to spend tonight's show looking and listening to me. I'm back on a solo tonight, part 4 of Life After the Uniform: Civil Service versus the Private Sector. And this is always an interesting topic because when you talk to veterans, and of course this show is kind of primarily aimed at veterans, but there's a lot of information I will talk about here on tonight that is just as useful for those of you that are not veterans, because I'm going to give you some of the ins and outs between the two different career paths. But it's interesting enough when you have a veteran thinking about leaving the service, and I can tell you, one of the things being in the military, especially if it's a career, and for those of you veterans out there, whether you spent a career or not, or you were just in for 4 or 5 years, whatever you served, you remember that during that 4 or 5 years time that you felt, at least I know the majority of us did, felt very comfortable in the fact that you had a job. You may or may not, I'm going to go out on a limb here and stretch and say maybe you were enjoying what you were doing for a while, and then after a while maybe decided not so much, time to go. For those of you that spent the career, you must have enjoyed it at least enough to stay and make a career out of it. And you know that you had a job, you were getting paid, you were traveling, you were doing different things, and you were learning a lot. And that's one of the things about the military is that you get to do so many things that people don't ordinarily do. So there are advantages, whether you spend a career or whether you just spend a few years. But then, we have to look at it. It all comes down to the time of what do we do? What do we do when it's time to get out? Whether you spent that enlistment in, or you spent that tour in, or you made it a career and you're coming up on 20 years, 22 years, whatever it is, and you've made that decision. I think it's time for me to move on. You start looking at it. And I remember when I was getting ready to retire from the Army, and this has been so long ago now, it's 2001 when I retired. And yes, it's been that long, and yes, I am that old. But I still remember the thought process I went through. I remember looking at everything, and of course, I did have some help pushing me in the direction because I did injure myself on active duty and had to have arthroscopic surgery, which kind of put a kibosh on my running career in the military to a certain extent. So it kind of helped push me in that direction to retire. But I'm sitting there thinking to myself, here I've been in the military these past 21 years. I've enjoyed my time in the military. I've learned a lot. I've done so much. But I have not had to think about applying for a job, worrying about steady employment or anything like that for the last 21 years. And here I'm getting ready to walk out the door, give up this employment, give up this paycheck that I've had for the last 21 years. And yeah, if you retire, you do get a retirement check. But for those of you that have retired from the military, I'm sure you can understand when you say the majority of us that do retire cannot retire and live off what the military pays you in retirement. So you have to go out and look for something else. And you come and you make that decision. I'm going to go. It's time to go. So what do I do? Your mind starts racing, all the things to think about. But of course, one of the first things you do start thinking about is, gee, I have to find another career or another job, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to tell you an interesting story here. When I was stationed at Fort Benning back in the mid 1990s, I had an opportunity to go back to college and finish my undergraduate degree. And then I also had the opportunity, because I was an instructor there, to where I wasn't going on field exercises or anything like that. So as soon as I finished my undergraduate degree, I immediately applied and was accepted to graduate school. And I crammed my master's degree in a year. Now you're talking about something that made my brain hurt. But I was so glad to be able to do that because I was already kind of looking and taking that look for life beyond after the uniform, because I knew that I would need something to help carry me through. And I remember dealing with a number of people at the transition center there at the post. And in fact, I bought a used book for my master's program from one of the gentlemen who helped run the transition center. So we got into a pretty good discussion. And he said, one of the struggles that he had was, Fort Benning is the infantry training center for the Army. And he said, I get a lot of these career infantry guys coming in here, and they're concerned about, what am I going to do when I retire from the military? I may be a little too old, too beat up to get into something like law enforcement or something, where I can use the skills that I've won in the Army. And he had to have that conversation with him. There are other skills that you learn, but you have to start thinking about that. And you have to decide, going to school is a great opportunity while you're in the military. It can be difficult, but at the same time, you can do it. So if you were fortunate enough to do that, you've had a chance to do some pre-planning and some thinking. But when the time comes to make that decision, then you have to start looking at, how do I sell myself? And I talk to a lot of veterans, and one of the first things they start thinking about is, getting out of the military, and they start looking at civil service with the government versus private sector employment. Now, each one has its pros and cons, and we're going to talk just a little bit about that. And I'm going to give you some insights because, frankly, I've been down both roads. I started in the private sector and then later on transferred over and was hired by the government, and have spent a 22-year career now with the federal government as a federal employee. So I'm going to share some of the insights that I've learned about this, some of the things that I think may be helpful to you as we go through this. And of course, you got to make that decision. Which way should I go? And as I said, they each have pros and cons, but let me just kind of share with you, applying for civil service. When you go to apply for civil service, first of all, there's normally one most of the time there's normally one major format they use for their resumes. And normally to do that, you're going to go to opm.gov. You're going to create yourself an account, and it will take you through in there creating yourself a government formatted resume. So for those of you that may be interested, you haven't done that, you have to go to opm.gov, create your account, and it will help you take you through, require you to go through a bunch of information, answer questions, and help you format that resume in the normal format that most government agencies look for. So there's nothing earth-shattering there, but you just need to make sure that you have all your information, the stuff you did in the military. And that gets into a whole nother show we've talked about before, about how to sell yourself on what you did in the military using the right acronyms. And I'm not here to get in detail tonight about resumes, but when you get ready to apply for civil service, it's something you're going to have to do. The other thing that drives me crazy, and thank goodness I have not gone to look for another job within the government in the last 10 years. I've pretty much stayed where I'm at, and in fact, getting ready to retire near the end of this year for good. But when you apply for a federal position, you're going to find out as you look on OPM's website, you can go on there and look for jobs just about anywhere in the world, and in all kinds of specialties. And you're going to find out that a lot of them require what we call knowledge, skills, and abilities. Now, there are some of the agencies that are starting to pull back from this. And we call them KSAs. Some of you may be familiar with them, but the KSAs they're going to be specific skills that they're looking for when you apply for a position. And what they expect you to do is not only submit your resume, but they expect you to address your experiences in those areas in written form in a paragraph or two, where they want you to give them examples of how you meet that requirement, what knowledge, skills, or abilities you have for that particular requirement. So that's the other thing about looking at applying for a federal job, not only going in and setting up your resume, your OPM account, but being able to answer those knowledge, skills, and abilities. So, for those of you that haven't done this, go in and do some exploring first. It'll click as you look at it. The other thing I will tell you is, when you go to, as a veteran, when you go to apply for a federal job, if you're a honorably discharged veteran, you can claim a 5-point veterans preference in terms of scoring of your resume. So what that simply means is your status as a veteran will get you 5 additional points once they score your application. You can also, if you're a disabled veteran, you can also qualify for the 10 additional point category. So all that is on OPM's website. Again, like I said, I'm not here to try and teach you in detail, just to give you some information so we can compare these two processes. The other thing that's kind of interesting being in the military and looking at civil service is that if you are a military veteran, retired or no, you have the option of buying back your time from the government. I've got family members who spend time in the military, and they are in the process. They later on took federal civilian jobs, and they're in the process during their civilian career of buying back their military time so that their military time they spend will count towards their civil service retirement. There's a process for that. You can learn about that from OPM as well, but it's one of those things that differentiates between working in the public sector, working for the government in public service, or in the private sector. So, when you have to look at it, just about any job you get is going to give you an opportunity to grow, to train, to learn. And in the private sector, it's no different. Their application processes differ from the government because they vary from organization to organization, whereas primarily the government has a fairly standard application process that you follow. Most companies in the private sector don't require KSAs. Although they tend to, how can I say, they tend to really screen your resume much closer looking for information. And that's how they do it when they don't require write-ups that identify specifically the skills you have for the position. Their interviews sometimes can be a little more, how can I say, a little more job centric, whereas with the government, part of the interview will be job centric, but part of it will be just to gauge you as in what you are as a person, and how you are and how you answer the questions. Now, along with the government side, the private sector, a lot of companies do have veteran hiring initiatives. And while you don't necessarily get points added to any type of numerical rating of your resume, they do have initiatives to where they have incentives for hiring veterans. So you can get a little bit of that veteran incentive from both government, public service, or in the private sector. So when you start thinking about it, you just have to decide what you think is best. Again, using OPM system is a big help. For government, you follow that system, and it's really a great system to use. Not hard, can be a little frustrating at times, I have to tell you, but I have not had to use it in quite a while. But it is still there, still in use by the government. So for those of you that haven't taken a look at it, don't sell yourself short. For those of you that spend a lot of your time in combat arms, there are still companies out there that are looking for people that have management skills, program management skills, leadership skills. So you have to take a look at what you've done in the military and how you can transform that over. So it's kind of interesting when we look at this that the government side seems to be a little more attractive. And I'm going to get into it here in a few minutes, some of the pros and cons. But I will tell you this, don't be overwhelmed when you look at the government's hiring requirements and you go to OPM and look at the system. You as a veteran have to make that determination of what you think will be better for you in the long run. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we come back from our break. But right now we're going to take a short break and hear from our sponsors. All right, welcome back, everyone. And you've been listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner with your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And I've been sharing some information with you on life after the uniform, part 4, civil service versus private sector employment. And I want to talk now about some of the pros and cons, because I think that's where the rubber really meets the road on this topic. And there's going to be pros and cons for each path that you take. But I will tell you, not too long ago, well, it's been maybe I better say a few years back, because we seem to forget COVID lasted several years, and I always seem to lose that time. But about 4 or 5 years ago, give or take, we went through a time within the government where we really did not get any annual pay raises. There were several years in a row where budget and things like that, federal budgets, Congress was arguing. We had politicians up there that said, no, we can't afford that. No, we're not giving the public sector government employees a pay raise. And when all of that happened, I remember there was a lot of turmoil in the news and a lot of opinion in the news, to where a lot of government employees at that time were demoralized quite a bit, because quite frankly, we had members of Congress sitting up there demonizing us to the general public, saying that we don't deserve that money, we were overpaid. So many different things they made public comments about that really did hit the morale of the federal workforce. And there were all kinds of things that they talked about as to why that was the case. And of course, the public kind of bought into some of that, because they were not fully informed on a lot of circumstances. And I will tell you, one of them that caught my eye before I really start getting into comparing and contrasting the two was that the politicians seemed to hone on the fact that during the time there was a downturn in the economy and people were out of work, that all of us bad federal employees were still sitting up there and we all still had jobs, while you poor people out there in the private sector, and this was the politicians doing this, made us look bad to the rest of the general public, because we had jobs and a lot of them had lost their job and been laid off. And, the things that they don't tell you was that's an individual choice, first of all. As I compare and contrast some of this, you'll kind of understand why I made the decision I made. But I had several opportunities, and this will be one of the first comparisons, is generally in the public sector, in the private sector, a lot of jobs do pay more than civil service in the public sector do for the government. And once I left my first private sector job as working for a contracting company and went to the government, I started to see the ins and outs. And I worked for the government. I had worked for the government about 4 or 5 years. And one of the gentlemen I worked with in the private sector, he and I kept in touch. And in fact, he talked with me a number of times and twice tried to hire me back into the private sector, because of my specialty. The things that I did with the government were in demand in the private sector. And of course, his lure to get me to move back was higher salary. He told me, he said, yeah, I can get you a nice pay raise compared to what you're making in the government. So when we were being demonized by some of our so-called elected representatives to the public, that was something that people didn't think about. You have a choice to make. I chose to go to public sector employment with the government as opposed to private sector. I knew I would take a little less in pay, but I chose it. And that's one of the differences. You can make more money oftentimes working in the private sector for a lot of the large corporations. A number of the companies will pay higher than what the government pays in a number of specialties and areas. So if you're going to make that decision to work for the governments, one of the first things you have to think about as you compare these two is The government is not there to make you rich. They're not going to make you rich, albeit you can be paid a fair salary as you learn, you grow, and move your way up. But you can actually make more money in the private sector. So that's one of the differences you have to think about when do I want to do this? What are my options here? Yeah, I can make more money in the private sector, but where's the trade-off for the government? So I'm going to talk about that. And I just used that example to bring up that point. So when you start looking at public service in terms of working for the government, I already mentioned, the salaries normally can be a little lower. So that might be a con to, as opposed to a pro to some people. But there are a lot of good things about working for the government. Number one, the government is still one of the few hiring organizations out there that still have a pension. And yes, I said a pension, an actual pension for time you spend working for the government. Now, granted, you pay some into that pension as well as the government, but by the time that you meet retirement eligibility, you are eligible for a pension for the rest of your life, just like our fathers and grandfathers used to get working for companies. The old adage, they work 35 years, get a gold watch and a pension, walk out the door into retirement and fish until they die. Now, I don't plan on fishing until I die when I retire, but same concept applies there, that I have the ability now, because of the decision I made when I retire from my government position, I will leave the government with a civil service pension. Now, that being said, a lot of private companies no longer offer pensions. Your retirement is based primarily in the private sector, yes, on Social Security that you pay and what you can do with your investment in 401k. So when you start looking at the government compared to the private sector, government still has a pension. As long with that, the government also, you pay into Social Security while working for the government. So you're also going to be eligible for Social Security. And the government also has a 401k, which is they call the thrift savings plan. Same animal, just a different name in the government. And the government will, depending on how much you put in, once you reach your maximum that you can put in every paycheck, the government matches up to 5% of what you put into your TSP. So you have your salary, you have your Social Security, and you have a thrift savings plan with the government. In the private sector, you're going to have a salary, albeit it might be a little higher, but you also have Social Security and your retirement account. The only thing you're not going to have once you leave private sector employment is that pension to replace your salary. So keep that in mind. Government still offers a pension, and although I will tell you, with some of the latest legislation that the House is talking about right now, they want to cut the federal government pension off for new hirees. Hasn't been passed yet, but that's what they're talking about wanting to do. They also want to make some changes to the current retirement system, and it's all about money. So, we'll see where they go from there, and then how that changes in the future. The other thing that I can tell you that we saw when, there was an economic downturn, a lot of people lost their jobs, was the government still has that job security for the most part. And when you're working for state, local governments, or the federal government, the majority of the time you have a little more job security than you do in the private sector. One of the reasons why is many states are work at will states, which means that if they don't need you, they can simply let you go. There aren't really what you would call employment contracts that guarantee you employment. You're there until they no longer need you, or until you leave on your own volition. So in the government, it's a little different. Once you are vested in your government position, which normally your probationary period, I believe now is 3 years. Once you go past your probationary period, you're vested in your government career. And unless you do something egregious illegal or something of that nature, you can pretty much count on, moving from different job to different job, possibly from agency to agency, and finishing your career with the government, as long as you do what you're supposed to do. So again, one of the differences there is the job security. When you look at federal employment as opposed to employment in the private sector, most government positions are going to offer a lot more job security. Again, what are you giving up for that? You're giving up sometimes more salary in the private sector than in the government sector that you would earn. The government does normally get annual raises. I said a little while ago, we went several years in a row where we got no raises at all because of all the things that were going on. But normally, under most normal circumstances, we would get some type of annual raise, even if it's a small one. Some years are better than others. In the private sector, a lot of times your annual raises come a little bit easier for you in terms of consistency. But again, when you're in the private sector, your company's only going to be able to do what their profit margin allows them to do. So there you're producing a product, producing a profit, and that's where a lot of your bonuses, a lot of your pay, a lot of your pay raises and things like that are tied to, as opposed to the government where, we're not necessarily producing a product per se, although, I produce a lot of work products on a daily basis, but it's a little different type of product when you think about it. So when you think about it, job security with the government, annual raises most of the time, as opposed to in the private sector, you do normally will get the annual raises if the businesses are doing well. But again, most organizations are in work at will states, and there's no employment contract like you have more or less with the government in terms of job security. Now, there are some additional accepted agencies. There are some government agencies that kind of operate, I don't want to say outside government regulation because that's not accurate, but they are granted by Congress the ability to use different pay bands and pay processes. They also are exempted by Congress from certain government regulations, such as contracting and things of that nature. And some of those accepted process agencies actually can pay better than the regular standard government agency. So we do have some agencies. I will tell you a lot of our law enforcement agencies, Homeland Security, some of our national security agencies, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Some of those are just among the few of the accepted agencies within the government that have that flexibility when it comes to personnel, hiring, salaries, and things of that nature. So you do have that. Benefits within the government are usually pretty good. You're going to have subsidized health care, dental care, life insurance, long-term care, all of the things that, you would hope to get from an employer. Now, I will have to say that what I've seen within the government, some of those benefits do cost a little bit less than what I've seen my peers pay on the outside. But private sector companies also, not all of them, but a number of them do, of course, provide those types of benefits as well, only at a little different price. So again, you got to take a look. What do you think is best for you? If you're looking at long-term career, like I did, I went with the government side, and I decided that was a way to go for me. Kind of glad I did now at this point because I'm getting ready to retire again, as I mentioned, and I'm gonna try and enjoy the rest of my life once I do. So it just depends. And speaking of retirement with the government, you can also take an early retirement once you reach a certain age. If you've been working for a certain number of years and you reach a minimum age, you can actually retire, albeit it's a reduced retirement, but you can still leave with a pension. Not too many companies on the outside have anything like that. As I mentioned earlier, A lot of the companies on the outside no longer have pensions, period. So that's one of the big advantages of looking at the public sector and government employment versus private sector employment in terms of, what you want to do and what you think is best for you. Both career paths, I think, offer a lot of adventure. Even with the federal government, you have an opportunity to move all over, in fact, all over the world in some cases, because the government has organizations, offices in countries all over the world, as well as all over the United States, just like your private sector company, a lot of the companies do, especially the bigger companies. So you have that opportunity to learn, to go up, to transfer, as do the folks in the private sector within their organizations. So that's one area where I think both the government and the private sector have something very close together going there. But when you think about it, we look at this and we think that, making that decision on whether to go into public sector work with the government or private sector with a company is an individual decision. You got to take a look and say what's best, think what's best for you. For me, I took the job security in the government sector as opposed to the higher salary in the private sector. And now I'm at the point where I'm going to be able to reap the benefits of it and have a pension. When I've got peers who work in the private sector that will be working longer than I am, to make sure that they shore up their 401ks and everything else for retirement. So again, it's an individual preference. It's an individual thing that you have to look at. Do I want to spend time? Do I mind giving up a little bit of salary for job security and a pension? Although, like I said, be watching the news to find out what Congress is going to do in the future in terms of government pay, benefits, and government employment. You need to take a look at that so you're caught up. GovExec is one of those places where you can read a lot about that as it happens. So for those of you that are interested, you can simply go online, look up GovExec, and you will find it's a reporting and news organization that reports about everything civil service with the federal government, and you'll be able to find a lot of information. Remember, go in and take a look at the Office of Personnel Management. You've heard it called OPM. OPM.gov is where you go to take a look for federal jobs, go in there, create an account, set up your resume, and then you can simply just use that resume that you set up to apply for federal positions that you may find. So for those of you that are getting ready to make that jump out of the military, you're getting ready to retire, or you're just getting ready to say it's time for me to leave, take a look, see which one fits you better, see which one you think is going to be better for you in the long run, and make that leap. If you have any questions and you'd like me to respond, or you just have something in general that you'd like to share with me about the topic, you can always reach me at literaryvet.com. My email is on the website, and feel free to drop me a note if you have any particular questions about this subject. I do not mind at all sharing my experiences and background with you, and I'm sure that I can provide you some good information. So feel free to email me at literaryvet@gmail.com, and I will definitely respond to your email. All right, so I want to thank you for taking the time tonight to spend with us. I realize that might have been a kind of down and dirty comparison of civil service versus private sector employment, but there's so many other things we could get into, but I wanted to hit the highlights with you just to share some of that, to give you some food for thought. So I want to thank you for taking the time to spend with us this evening. And for those of you out there watching the show who look for our information on veterans and veteran service providers and veteran programs, I'm encouraging you to go to the veteransguide.org. The Veterans Guide provides you with necessary information you need to obtain maximum benefits when you leave the service. Ladies and gentlemen, as a veteran, you're entitled to so many different things, and the Veterans Guide is there online for you at veteransguide.org. You need to go take a look at it. The site is well laid out. It's broken down so you can go through and click on the different areas. You can also contact the outreach director there, Luke Daniels, at pr@veteransguide.org. So either way, if you want to contact them directly, you can send Luke a message there and he'll get it. But make sure you take a look at the website as well. A lot of good information there. If you're a departing veteran, or maybe I should say departing veteran, you're an exiting veteran, leaving the service for life after. We wish you the best. And for our veterans out there, again, we want to thank you for your service. Thank you for watching us here on the GoingSoloMedia.com Veterans Corner, and I hope to see you on our next show.